Keeping the pressure off of rookie quarterback Spencer Rattler and turning the pressure up on Justin Herbert is key for the New Orleans Saints as they take on the Los Angeles Chargers. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints made a curious move with safety Jonathan Abram amongst their sort of flurry of roster moves on Tuesday afternoon. But I'll explain to you what I think they might be thinking. We're going to dive into that. We'll also take a look at where Marquez Valdes-Scantling ends up helping the New Orleans Saints on offense. And we're going to kick it all off by taking a look at keeping pressure off of Spencer Rattler, but why turning the pressure up on Justin Herbert is just as effective if the New Orleans Saints intend to compete in Los Angeles on Sunday. We appreciate you very much. As always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. And for being an everyday, you're here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Head over to FanDuel.com today. Place your first $5 bet and you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. The New Orleans Saints must keep the pressure off of Spencer Rattler if they want any chance to compete against the Los Angeles Chargers on Sunday. I'll put a little asterisk past the name Spencer Rattler there because there is a chance, not really a big chance, but there's an unlikely scenario where Derek Carr does return in time for this game. But considering he just started throwing again this week, doesn't look like it's trending that way. But if Derek Carr isn't ready to go, head coach Dennis Allen has already mentioned that Spencer Rattler is the starting quarterback this weekend. If you want to hear more about that, we covered it in yesterday's episode. But when it comes down to this game, keeping pressure off of Spencer Rattler and putting pressure on Chargers quarterback Justin Herbert should be the number one priority on both sides of the football. Let me tell you why. Let's just look at pressure percentages to start. Let's take a look at the Saints offense right now. The Saints offense is allowing the 8th highest pressure rate so far this season. Of course, their interior offensive line has been in turmoil. Their tackles have been struggling here as of late. So there's been no real solace for the New Orleans Saints recently on their offensive line. That could change this week as the team is set to get back 2 players on its interior, Lucas Patrick and potentially starting right guard Cesar Ruiz as well. That's good news for the New Orleans Saints because they're about to take on the Los Angeles Chargers, who have the 13th highest pressure rate generated so far this season. Why is this a big deal? Well, Spencer Rattler versus pressure, 43.5% completion percentage, only 117 passing yards, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception, and a 41.4 passer rating. Those are all the numbers you would expect to see from a rookie quarterback that is seeing pressure on a ton of dropbacks so far this season. Perhaps one of the biggest things that has maybe soured people on seeing Spencer Rattler. But for the Saints, they believe that they haven't really gotten to see the most out of Spencer Rattler because of the amount of pressure. He has spent so far 41.3% of his dropbacks under pressure so far this season. Hard to evaluate a young quarterback if you're an NFL franchise with those numbers. Some people may disagree with that, but that's certainly the way that the New Orleans Saints look at it. So that's a big reason why you need to keep the pressure off of Spencer Rattler, give him the opportunity to be able to operate without pressure and without pressure in his face in particular up the interior. So the Saints could be heading to a positive direction there a little bit when it comes down to getting guys like Lucas Patrick and potentially Cesar Ruiz back. As for getting pressure on Justin Herbert, that's the other key for the New Orleans Saints going into this game. Right now, the Saints are generating the 4th lowest pressure rate. Meanwhile, the Chargers are allowing the 3rd highest pressure rate on their offense. So one of those two things has to give. Either the Saints are going to struggle getting pressure against a offensive line that they should be able to get pressure against, or the Chargers are going to struggle because they have been struggling all season to keep pressure at bay when it comes to Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert under pressure so far this season, 52.1% completion percentage, only 211 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and a 62.1 passer rating. Not as Not as bad as what we've seen from Spencer Rattler under pressure, but again, one of them is a rookie quarterback. The other one is is a few years into his new deal and is a first-round pick of a quarterback. So you would expect one of them to be better. That's what you're seeing, but the separation between the two, not drastically different, if we're being honest. So for the New Orleans Saints, getting pressure on Justin Herbert might allow them to be able to play them into some mistakes. The Los Angeles Chargers do a very good job of not turning the ball over. So far this season, only 4 giveaways on the year. The Saints would love to tick that number back up. They've done a good job with at least 1 takeaway in all 7 games so far this season. If they can do that at SoFi this weekend, it at least puts them in position to maybe surprise or be able to kind of get back on the winning side of the column. I'm not saying that they're likely to do it or that they will do it or that they can do it or anything like that, but certainly this pressure conversation is one of the biggest keys to potentially getting it done. So that's going to be a big thing that we're going to be watching over the course of this weekend, is how the New Orleans Saints handle on the offensive side and create on the defensive side pressure for these quarterbacks. A couple of other numbers for you to know going into this game. Let's take a look at scoring offense for both of these teams. The New Orleans Saints have the number 11 scoring offense in the NFL. It might come off as a surprise, but that's because those first 2 weeks of 91 combined points, still doing a lot of heavy lifting. Over the course of the past 5 weeks, New Orleans Saints 5-game losing streak, they're only number 21 in the NFL when it comes to points scored. 86 points in those 5 games versus the 91 they scored in the opening 2. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Chargers have the number 1 scoring defense in the NFL in terms of points allowed. So this is going to be the big matchup here, right? Not only are the New Orleans Saints going to have to keep pressure off their quarterback, put pressure on their opposing quarterback, but in doing so, they've got to be able to keep points off the board for the Chargers, which shouldn't be super hard. The Chargers are not averaging a lot of points per game so far this season. But on the other hand, the Saints, more importantly, need to get back to putting points up on the board and doing so without gifting points to the opposing team, which has been a consistent issue for the New Orleans Saints between a fumble recovery that could have gone back for a touchdown last week, pick sixes this year, as well as, of course, the fumbled punt return and all these other things they've done. Unfortunately, a bit of a bad job in terms of giving up points to the opposing team. So that's something they absolutely have to erase this weekend. And finally, the last thing that I want to point out here is run before contact. This is the amount of yards a running back gets before they're ever touched by a defensive player. Over the course of the first 2 weeks, according to Next Gen Stats, the Saints allowed just 0.3 yards before contact per carry. It's over the first 2 weeks. That was the best in the NFL in terms of their run defense. Well, since then, the opposite. Instead of it being 0.3, it's 3.0 yards before carry per game over the last 5 weeks, the NFL's worst. Now, they might get a little bit of solace here because when it comes to the Chargers, they do run the football a lot. They are very dedicated to their run game, but they're not the most successful rushing offense in terms of production. Number 21 in the NFL when it comes to yards before carry. Number 29 in the NFL when it comes to yards before contact. Number 29 in the NFL when it comes to yards after contact. So they're not very good at picking up yards before contact. And once those running backs get contact, they tend to go down. So this could be the saving grace for the New Orleans Saints defense, especially if they get guys like Colin Saunders and Pete Werner back for their defensive front. So those are 3 big things we're going to be watching, led off, of course, by pressure on those quarterbacks. Coming up next, I want to take a look at Marquez Valdes-Scantling and what it is that he brings to the New Orleans Saints. The one big area where he has the opportunity to have a major impact for New Orleans is clear as day. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Game Time, the absolute best place to buy tickets for your favorite events, whether it's sporting events, comedy, theater, concerts, whatever it is that you're looking for. They've got you taken care of. And right now, for this New Orleans Saints at Los Angeles Chargers game, $43 ticket right now is the cheapest ticket in the 500 section to get you into SoFi Stadium for that action. You can go and check them out in LA. If you're a Saints fan in the area, I would highly recommend grabbing those tickets on Game Time. And of course, I'm going to help you out with that right now. First of all, let me tell you about Game Time Picks. It's curation that makes it even easier for you to be able to save more on your favorite events without having to sift through thousands of seats. highly recommend toggling on all-in pricing. The feature will allow you to see the total up front, so you're not taken by surprise by any of those maybe hidden fees you're going to see on other ticket marketplaces. That's how Game Time helps to take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. It's not you versus a bunch of mystery lineups. It's not you having to deal with injury management each and every week, bad trade proposals by your idiot friends and all those other things if you're playing a redraft league and stuff like that. No, none of that. It's daily fantasy made easy. It's just you versus the house. Prize Picks, you pick football, baseball, basketball, college football, college basketball, hockey, whatever it is that you're looking for, and you'll be able to simply go up against Prize Picks projections. They'll put a projection out there like Justin Jefferson, 83.5 receiving yards on the week. You choose more or less. It's that simple. You do that for 2 to 6 players. If you get 4 of those players right, you can win up to 100 times your entry back just by playing. It is absolutely awesome. So go and download the Prize Picks app today and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. It's over at Prize Picks. Run your game. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints newly acquired wide receiver Marquez Valdes-Scantling could have a pretty big impact for New Orleans if he's able to get out on the field this week. And the one area that you can absolutely expect him to be at least leaned on, right? We'll see if he's able to create the production, but to be leaned on by this New Orleans Saints team is going to be the downfield, deep ball, 20 plus yards downfield. That's where the New Orleans Saints need the most help. That's where the New Orleans Saints need production. And that's where Marquez Valdes-Scantling does have the ability to be able to make an impact. Now, I do want to say for you, an everydayer, you're hearing me say it, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, because that's the way it's pronounced. Ding, ding, ding. We don't have to learn how to repronounce Marquez as Marquez. I can keep in my habits after learning from Marquez Callaway. So we're doing great here. I was going to say pour one out for me, but instead just pop a bottle. Have a lot of fun. All right, so that's our celebration for today. That's how this season's going so far. I'm taking the little victories, all right? So when it comes down to Marquez Valdes-Scantling, one of the big places where he is going to be expected to impact this team is to help replace the loss of Rashid Shaheed. Now, obviously, you need multiple players in replacing Rashid Shaheed. Marquez Valdes-Scantling at 6'4", 206 pounds is not going to be out there returning kicks for you, but that's where people and players like Jermaine Jackson and Mason Tipton and potentially Alante Taylor, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Kendre Miller, and others will contribute in terms of helping to take the ball out, get you some of those return yards, things like that. Jermaine Jackson in the punt return game, handling that. So that's the way that the Saints are going to make up for the loss of Rashid Shaheed on special teams when it comes to the returner conversation. When it comes to the wide receiver conversation, things are a little bit different. Now, first of all, the Saints will probably, I'm going to say probably, right? Because we got to see how concussion protocol goes for him and all these other things, but will probably be getting wide receiver Chris Olave back this weekend. A lot of people got a little bit kind of concerned when Dennis Allen said on Monday that Chris Olave was still in concussion protocol. That actually makes sense. In order for you to advance through concussion protocol, you have to be at practice. The Saints haven't practiced since Wednesday of last week and won't practice until tomorrow, or rather later on today on Wednesday. So with that Thursday game and the weekend off and all these other things, you don't really have the ability to progress through concussion protocol when the metrics to progress to concussion protocol all come down to, that was a rough one, concussion protocol, come down to your participation in practice and things like that. So that's what to expect when it comes to Chris Olave. So obviously Olave, who is 2 of 3 on downfield targets of more than 20 yards downfield, though he will absolutely be a factor in that area. This is another one of those reasons why the Saints are wanting to get another look at Spencer Rattler. In the 2 games that he played, he got 2 snaps with Chris Olave. So that's another one of the reasons why they want him to start this weekend if Derek Carr is not ready to go. So here's the stats and information around the last 2 most involved years for Rashid Shaheed, 2023 and most of 2024, and then Marquez Valdes-Scantling, 2022 and 2023, when it comes to targets of 20 plus yards downfield. Now we're talking about air yards in those situations, right? So the ball traveling more than 20 yards as a target, as opposed to a catch and run beyond 20 yards. So when it comes to Rashid Shaheed, very hard to replace. Catching 41.7% of his targets of 20 or more yards downfield over the course of the past 2 seasons. So that's about a season and a half, if you want to call it that, quote unquote, a season in 7 games, or a season in 6 games rather. And put together 646 yards during that time, including 8 touchdown receptions. That's a 43.1 yard per catch average as well. So even if you don't remember all those numbers, which is a lot of numbers to throw at you, what you know is Rashid Shaheed, very reliable downfield, catching more than 40% of his passes. That's a really good metric. Basically, anything over 30%, 20 yards downfield is good or great, right? Depending upon how high above 30% you are. And then the yardage production, as well as, of course, the scoring potential of 8 touchdowns in that season in 6 games is massive. And this is one of the reasons why I said that Rashid Shaheed was a huge loss for New Orleans. I know, #analysis, great observation, Ross. But the biggest thing is that in the passing game, he was the team's most consistent scoring threat, right? Most consistent scoring threat in terms of his ability to be able to take the top off of a defense. And of course, him as a returner, still having that yards after catch ability if he gets the ball thrown to him in space. So that's a pretty big thing to lose out on if you're the New Orleans Saints. I'll take this a step further real quick. The Saints have targeted Rashid Shaheed on 14 passes of over 20 yards so far this season. That is more than they have targeted the rest of the team, the rest of the offense on 20-yard passes. Only 13 20-yard targets opposite or to any player not named Rashid Shaheed. So this was all Rashid Shaheed's game all the time. Now they're without him. Here's how Marquez Valdes-Scantling compares. If you're looking at his 2022 and 2023 numbers, I'm leaving his 2024 numbers out because he was only targeted like 9 times with Buffalo. So I'm going to go to 2022 and 2023. So technically more games, but still something to keep an eye out on. During that time, 35 20-plus yard targets versus the sample size we looked at for Rashid Shaheed, which was 36 20-plus yard targets. So this is a very even comparison. So instead of 41.7% of those receptions that Rashid Shaheed had, Marquez Valdes-Scantling during that time, 37.1%. So a difference of 15 receptions for Shaheed and 13 receptions for Marquez Valdes-Scantling. So we're really looking at a difference of 2 receptions in this situation, right? So Valdes-Scantling, the success that he found, 439 yards, so less in terms of yardage, and then only 2 receiving touchdowns. This is why I say Valdez-Scantling doesn't completely replace Rashid Shaheed for you. You need to get more production out of Chris Olave. You need to get Chris Olave more involved. You're going to have to find a third option out there if Valdez-Scantling isn't technically the third option behind Cedric Wilson Jr. We'll see how quickly he gets up on the playbook. But again, playing in offenses in Buffalo, Kansas City, and Green Bay shouldn't be too terribly dissimilar from what it is that the New Orleans Saints are doing with their offense. So Valdez-Scantling isn't going to be a 1-for-1 replacement for you. Now, albeit those were in different offenses and things like that, but he's not going to be a 1-for-1 replacement for you when it comes to Shaheed, his speed, his ability to take the top of the defense, all of those things. But he should help to contribute to that factor greater than anything else that he'll contribute to. Now, he does have a little bit of run after catch ability as well, but again, got to hit him in stride, got to hit him in space. That's been more of a Saints quarterback issue than it has been a receiver or skill position player issue, in my opinion, from what I've seen on the tape, just not really hitting guys in stride, not really being able to catch guys in space. And that's any quarterback that's playing for the Saints. That just hasn't been a part of the game for them for the past few years, really. So for Valdez-Scantling, the place where he's going to most immediately make that impact is the yards before catch, 20-plus yards downfield. Look for him to try to have an impact there, even if it's only for certain plays in this game while he gets brushed up on the playbook. So I wouldn't expect too much from Marquez Valdes-Scantling to get started with New Orleans. I wouldn't expect a lot from him, honestly, this season. We'll see how things go. But if there's going to be a place where he's going to be able to make some noise, it's going to be 20-plus yards downfield in trying to help replace a little bit of that production that the Saints lose from Rashid Shaheed. But they're definitely going to need contributions elsewhere in the passing game. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints, along with the move to sign Marquez Valdes-Scantling, also announced several other roster moves, including parting ways with safety Jonathan Abram, but I think they might have a plan in place to get him back to the active roster. I'll explain as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Still not feeling the New Orleans Saints very much. The line closed a little bit from 7.5 to 7. It's back out to 7.5 at this point. I wonder how much that will change once we know exactly who the starting quarterback is this week, although we have a pretty good idea that it's going to be Spencer Rattler. If it does end up being Derek Carr, I wonder which way that influences Vegas as this offense gets healthier, things like that. But needless to say, the New Orleans Saints set to be road underdogs in this matchup. So you can get in on that and much more all around FanDuel. That includes the NBA, which tipped off last night. The Pelicans opening up their season later against the Chicago Bulls here in town. You want to get on that as well. So much for you to check out over at FanDuel. And right now, new customers will get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you play your first $5 bet. Your first $5 bet gets you $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. Go and check them out today, FanDuel.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints making a flurry of roster moves before they begin practices this week for their Week 8 matchup. Of course, the New Orleans Saints will be back at practice later on today, so we'll have some practice updates and things for you in tomorrow's episode, as well as our crossover Thursday to help break that all down. Anything big and pressing going on, we'll have you covered over at louisianasports.net as well. Insiders will get all that information right after practice. If you're interested in joining the Insider program, I'll tell you about that here in a little bit. But let's continue on with some news for the New Orleans Saints here as we wrap up the show. So for the Saints, they made a couple of different moves that they announced on Tuesday afternoon. The biggest one, outside of the signing of Marquez Valdes-Scantling and the move of cornerback Paulson Adebo to injured reserve, although that's no surprise considering his injury, was the termination of the practice squad contract for safety Jonathan Abram. This one took a lot of people by surprise, myself kind of included. But then I thought about it and I thought about, okay, so what are some of the mechanics that go into this that could have led to this and what it is that the New Orleans Saints are kind of thinking in this situation? Here's what I think is happening. And this is a little bit of just like tricksy kind of stuff, right? In terms of having some conversations with guys before you move on with them. The advantage the New Orleans Saints have, and for you to remember throughout my entire spiel that I'm about to go on here, is that Jonathan Abram is a veteran on the practice squad, which means he doesn't have to clear waivers, right? It's his decision. If he signs with anybody else and stuff like that, no one can just pluck him up off the waiver wire and then leave the New Orleans Saints high and dry. So here's what I think is going on. So the Saints terminated the contract of Jonathan Abram off the practice squad. They brought back New Orleans native, former Tulane safety Roderick Teamer, who was with the team over the course of training camp, to fill that practice squad spot. So it seems pretty likely that the New Orleans Saints are not intending on getting Jonathan Abram back to their practice squad. So why would they move on from him in the first place? One thing is that the Saints have already exhausted all 3 of their game day elevations for Abram. They can't elevate him off the practice squad and have him on the game day roster anymore for the rest of the season. And thanks to the NFL's rule changes when it comes to that, releasing a player and bringing them back does not reset the counter unless you're in the postseason. Then that counter resets once you get to the playoffs. Not something that we expect for the New Orleans Saints at this time. And even in that case, well beyond that, well ahead of that point, still 10 games to go throughout the regular season. So this isn't a planning for the postseason kind of a move. So what we know is that the Saints are unlikely to bring him back to their practice squad. And that makes sense, right? Even on just the whole parting ways, nothing tricky about it or anything like that, just parting ways with the player, it would make sense, right? You've used all 3 of those standard elevations. If you leave him on the practice squad, he's just sitting there on the practice squad. He's a veteran that has done a lot for you and has been very understanding of being cut and brought back and being on the practice squad instead of being on the active roster and all that other stuff. He's been very understanding and he's rolled with that for 2 years now. So you do right by him in that case by moving on from him and letting him go and find another opportunity. But I'm not quite sure that's what the New Orleans Saints are at least expecting here. I think the Saints want to get him back to the active roster. Here's how they do it. as the Saints get healthier on the offensive roster, particularly on the offensive line, it's going to make some players that were added to the active roster to make sure that they had depth there, or even in some cases starters there, expendable to the point where you can take them off your active roster and then move them back to your practice squad. 2 players to watch in this category: center Connor McGovern and interior offensive lineman Kyle Hergel, right? Those are the 2 guys that I would watch in this situation. Now, you might say, well, Ross, Kyle Hergel performed better in the last game than Nick Saldiveri. Sure, completely understand that, but you're getting Lucas Patrick back. You're hoping to get Cesar Ruiz back this week. If that ends up being the case later on today when the Saints get back to practice, I could see a world in which the Saints move on from either Connor McGovern, if they want to have Lucas Patrick take over at center and keep Kyle Hergel at left guard, for instance, or waiving Kyle Hergel and then trying to get one of those 2 guys back to the practice squad. With that then open roster spot, bring Jonathan Abram back. When you're dealing with injuries over on your roster management becomes more about position to position exchange, right? I have a hurt left guard, I have a hurt right guard, I have a hurt center, so I need interior offensive linemen on my active roster, me being just like a general GM in that situation, right? But then as your team gets healthier, things become less one-to-one when it comes to roster spots. You might say, okay, this player is no longer needed because I'm healthier at that position. I'm going to move on from that player, but that doesn't mean that you go and find somebody from that same position. You're healthier at that position. Now you go and fill another need, right? You think about the Saints who had all these wide receivers ready to go for them. They had several in the several on the active roster, several on the practice squad. They end up moving on from A.T. Perry in order to add Connor McGovern to get their offensive line bolstered because of depth needs, injuries, things like that along that area of the game. It wasn't move on from a wide receiver, add a wide receiver. So it's not always one-to-one at the position. So since you're getting healthier, and if you can get Lucas Patrick back, which is expected considering that he was active on game day last week as a reserve player, or as a depth player, and then if you can really get Cesar Ruiz back this week, then all of a sudden your need for some of these other guys that you've added to your active roster becomes a little bit more insignificant. You also just moved on from Chris Reed in the midst of all of these practice squad moves and things like that. So getting another offensive lineman back to your practice squad would be an advantage. So let's think about Kyle Hergel in this situation. I'm just looking at Kyle Hergel because he's an undrafted free agent. A little bit easier to get him through waivers off your active roster and over to your practice squad. So if the Saints were to move on from Kyle Hergel because they're healthier on the interior, work to get Kyle Hergel back to the practice squad, but then in that sort of vacated active roster spot, you bring back Jonathan Abram, and then he's able to be somebody to where you don't have to worry about practice squad elevations and how many times you can do it. He's on your active roster, use him as you please, and all these other things. So I could see that being the case, especially again, to remind you, Jonathan Abram is a veteran, does not have to go through waivers. So you can literally ask him before you release him, stick around. We want to bring you back to the active roster. We just have to move some stuff around on the offensive line first, but got to make sure we're as healthy as we expect to be, if you're we being an organization, right? So that's what I'm watching when it comes to Jonathan Abram. His time with the New Orleans Saints on the practice squad might be done, but he could potentially be back for the team. Again, the other option is simply that the Saints used all of those practice squad elevations and then not going to keep him on the practice squad because he's not going to be able to do anything for you on game day in that case. So you move on, you give him an opportunity to go out there and find another team. That's the other option, but there could be some tricky roster management stuff going on. Just to make sure that everything else is clear, the other moves the Saints made in addition, or announced in addition to the signing of Valdez-Scantling, in addition to moving Paulson Adebo to injured reserve, is that they did indeed bring back Shamar Jean-Charles. I reported that yesterday on the practice squad. They brought back Roderick Teamer, who spent time with the team over the course of the offseason. That's to fill that practice squad spot for Jonathan Abram. And they moved on from Abram, as well as offensive lineman Chris Reed, as we mentioned earlier. We'll see if Abram's back. At least there's a pathway cut out for that to happen. Tomorrow's episode, Crossover Thursday, myself and the guys from Locked On Chargers going to be breaking down this matchup for you. I'll also have our squad show up later on today as well, breaking down some of the biggest stories around the NFC. Their shows are a lot of fun, so make sure you tune in for those as well. And don't forget, for your second listen today, go and check out Locked On Pelicans. Today is the day the Pelican season tips off this evening. Go and check out Jake Madison over at Locked On Pelicans. Going to give you everything you need to know. We thank you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation, I'll holla at you.